Hello again, everyone. My name is Azalea Collifer, and today I want to talk about teacher-student relationships, particularly in the form of how teachers can help or aid struggling students. This is my research, Educators as Allies, improving teacher preparation and training to support students facing mental, resource, or non-normative environment challenges in grade school. Let's get into it. Okay, so I want to begin with one of the most basic, but also most overlooked foundations of a child's success in school: the relationship they have with their teacher. Most people just think this means being nice or having classroom rules, but it's a lot deeper than that. And according to the National Library of Medicine, a positive teacher student relationship is built on trust, mutual respect, emotional support, and effective communication, which is basically all the stuff that makes students feel safe enough to actually learn in school. And research backs this up. In a study by Miller Lewis et al. In 2014, researchers tracked 460 Australian students across 3 key years, from preschool through actual secondary school, and found that kids who had stable, high quality relationships with their teachers showed fewer emotional and behavioral problems and an increased palate for learning by age 6. And that's kind of a big deal because the effect held, even when researchers controlled for stuff like mental health, family income, parenting style, or even when the kid came from a non normative home. This means that the relationship with the teacher, just on its own, played a huge role in how these kids developed mentally and emotionally, regardless of where they were in their life. Meaning that teacher student relationships are emotional, not just instructional, and they require a level of empathy that can literally protect kids from mental health struggles and behavioral issues during critical development years that affect their lives as well as their learning, especially from kids coming from, once again, non normative homes, low income backgrounds, or even those with learning and emotional disabilities. That really and truly is the foundation, because without it, everything else, like lessons, tests, grades, kind of loses meaning for students who already feel like they're kind of already on the outside. And in the next slide, I'm going to look at the connection to what these teachers can actually do. Okay, so now that we know that strong teacher student relationships matter, let's talk about what happens when they don't happen. Because in schools across the country, especially in under resourced communities, teachers are expected to connect with their students without ever really learning how. And these next set of examples, they come straight from the educators, researchers, and students who lived the problem firsthand. We can start with Russell McLean, who gave a TED Talk about stereotype threat and implicit bias, aka the idea that when students feel judged based on their mental ability, race, gender, or background, they internalize those beliefs. Their brain starts working overtime, not on the test, but on managing anxiety. As McLean puts it, stereotype threat causes excessive cognitive load, which disrupts memory, confidence, and performance. And the kind of kicker is that it starts as early as elementary school and it can affect everything through college. Meaning that when teachers unknowingly express low expectations, even just through body language or comments like, maybe this subject isn't your thing, they reinforce the idea that some kids don't belong. McLean says, how can we expect students to believe in their greatness if we don't believe in it first? And that's where teacher student relationships come in. When teachers are trained to recognize bias and actively show belief in their students, it doesn't just change test scores, it protects mental health. Next, we can turn to Felton Moss, a black male educator who shared a powerful moment of reflection in his article, Why Black Boys' Sneakers Should Matter to Educators. As his student named Jalen was taking his time getting to class, focused on his Nike Air Force Ones, Moss, in a rush, scolded him instead of asking him what the shoes meant to him. Later, Moss admitted that just one moment could have been a chance to connect, to ask questions, to spark a conversation, or even build a lesson around why that mattered to Jalen. Moss later realized the moment was a missed opportunity, and with the right mindset, he knows that with the right training, a teacher could have used those sneakers to connect on a deeper level. He writes, I believe in the power of building relationships to get students to do the math problem they otherwise wouldn't have tried. But because that moment was missed, so was his relationship with Jalen. And that's kind of the heart of it, because this isn't about shoes, but it's about students trying to be seen and teachers not being trained to recognize those moments. And for students who come from unstable homes or with emotional or mental struggles or limited resources, those small acts of connections really matter because they could be the difference between shutting down and actually staying engaged in school. Moss's story shows that even dedicated educators can feel unprepared, not because they don't care, but because traditional teaching and training often overlooks emotional intelligence. Moss's story also shows a thing or two about culture and culture capital. Even as a culturally aware educator, he didn't even feel equipped in that moment. He needed more than his instincts, and he needed training in how to recognize culturally rooted expressions of value, resource, and stress. And after looking at the two resources, we have to question, what's the through line here? Because in all these actual cases, whether it be McLean or Moss, we see that the problem isn't teachers don't care, but it's that they're not being equipped to meet students with empathy, cultural understanding, and conditional and mental awareness. And the result is that vulnerable students fall through those cracks. Not because they're incapable, but because they have no one to build a bridge to where they are. And that brings us to the next slide, which what happens when schools actually do train teachers to build those bridges? Now that we've actually seen the emotional cost of weak teacher-student relationships, we have to ask, what happens when schools actually invest in fixing it? And that's where the work of Amy J. Kay and her colleagues come in. They piloted a multi-year program in 5 urban schools that were facing real, intense challenges like poverty, community violence, and behavioral struggles, along with widespread trauma. But instead of just telling the teachers to try harder, they gave them something that they rarely get, which is support, time, and training that actually match the emotional complexity of their classroom. Teachers received in-depth workshops on trauma, crisis management, and what they call social emotional learning, or SEL. But the real breakthrough came in with the 120 hours of in-school coaching. Consultants worked alongside teachers not just in theory, but right in their classrooms, helping them respond in the moment, reflect after the fact, and develop real personalized strategies. And what happened during that process was actually extremely needed and eye-opening to many of the teachers. Because teachers actually began to see their students differently. Before the training, many believed they actually understood what their students or what their kids were going through. But the data had suggested otherwise. After the study and implementation of SEL, 70% of teachers identified family stressors as the biggest factor affecting their students' mental health in the classroom. And over half reported trauma and disruptive behavior as major obstacles, aka not just rude or disruptive natures, but it's actually trauma that caused them to be what they looked as disruptive. And about 95% said they finally realized that these issues directly made it harder for kids to actually learn in their classroom. But only 36% said they actually knew how to respond. Many admitted that they felt unprepared and incapable when the emotional crisis showed up in their classroom, which is that disconnect between teachers' assumption and what actually they came to understand. That is what the major takeaway of this study is. It wasn't just that the students who needed support, but the teachers did too. And when they received it, everything began to change. As for after the program, 99% of teachers said they learned tools that actually needed in the classroom, and more felt confident in supporting students through emotional distress. Schools started running their own internal SEL workshops, passing on what they had learned. And importantly, teachers started moving away from harsh punishment and more towards understanding. They stopped asking what's wrong with this student and started asking what happened to this student and how can I help? Which is kind of the heart of the teacher-student relationships. Empathy in action. And it doesn't show up by accident, but it has to be cultivated and modeled and practiced and supported at every level of a school system. Case study proves that when teachers are given time and training to actually understand their students, especially those dealing with trauma, hardship, or poverty, they don't just connect better. They transform the classroom into a space where healing, trust, and learning can actually begin. However, what if there was a clear, repeatable system for building trust with every student, not just a reaction to trauma and building empathy, but a daily practice. And that's what the next method, EMR, was designed to do. All right. Now that we've seen how powerful teacher student relationships can be, but the question still stands, how do you actually teach teachers to build those relationships and make them stay? Not just in theory, but in practice, every day. And that's what the EMR method is about. Developed by Clayton Cook and colleagues, EMR, short for Establish, Maintain, and Restore, is a framework that helps teachers intentionally cultivate positive and lasting relationships with every student, especially those at risk of disengagement due to trauma, mental, behavioral, or unstable home environment issues. Phase 1, Establish. This is where connection begins. Teachers are trained to build initial rapport, especially with students who may be disconnected or withdrawn. You can think of this as relationship building with intention, asking students about their interest, making eye contact, using their name, showing curiosity about their life. The article makes it clear that these simple acts of warmth and visibility build the path to actual trust, which is quite needed or essential for students who may not get the recognition elsewhere. And phase 2 is maintain. Once that connection is there, the work shifts to keeping it strong through daily, consistent, and positive interactions. This includes small check ins, positive feedback, joking, playfulness, or just simple moments of shared humanity. Teachers in the study reported using reflection tools to help monitor the health of their relationships across time, preventing disconnect before it spirals. However, no relationship is perfect, and particularly one with a authority dynamic like teachers. And that brings us to the most important part of the model, in my opinion, phase 3, restore, which is building the trust after conflict. When a relationship is damaged, or a student gets disciplined, and a teacher says something in frustration, or trust is broken, most classrooms don't offer a way to recover that. That tension often festers, and it leads to other further disengagement and conflict. But the Restore unit gives teachers an actual protocol for how to reconnect after conflict. Teachers are taught to identify which students they're disconnected from using a relationship tracking tool. Then you initiate intentional conversations with the students after that incident. And then you must ask restorative, non-judgmental questions like, what happened? Or how did this affect both of us? Or what can we do to fix it and move forward together? Or how can I make you not mad at me anymore? Cook's team emphasizes that unresolved conflict can erase weeks of empathetic progress. But when teachers step in to repair rather than reprimand, or in a lot of cases, not do anything at all and leave it be, the result is a more stronger, kind of resilient bond, in which the practice isn't just emotionally healing, but it's behaviorally effective. The study found that increases in teacher-student relationship quality were directly associated with improvements in academic engagement and reductions in disruptive behavior. And why? Because students felt seen, respected, and safe to re-enter the learning space even after conflict. Teachers also reported that the restore phase gave them language and confidence in situations where they previously felt helpless. Many said that without this model, they often felt like they didn't know how to rebuild the relationships, or even that they were allowed to. Cook's study showed that teachers who used the EMR model saw measurable improvements in teacher-student relationship quality, student behavior and engagement, and most impressively, academic time on task. Also, EMR explained that 98% of the variance between classrooms in those outcomes. That means it wasn't just the school or the students, but it was the EMR training that actually made that difference in those schools. Even more, teachers themselves benefited. Stronger relationships led to less burnout and more job satisfaction and a clearer sense of purpose. When teachers feel equipped to emotionally support students, not just academically, the whole kind of climate of the school changes. Meaning relationships matter. But as Cook research proves, they don't just happen. They have to be built, sustained, or repaired if they need to be on purpose. And now let's take that even further. What happens when a school adopts a relationship-centered approach to discipline itself, using things like the EMR method? Let's talk about restorative justice. And finally, so far we looked at how teacher training can build strong student relationships from the start, and even how to restore them after things go wrong. But what happens when schools as a whole rethink how they handle misbehavior, not just as punishment, but as a chance to rebuild trust within the community? And that's restorative justice. Restorative justice is a relationship-centered approach to discipline that focuses not on punishing students, but on repairing harm and restoring the classroom community. Instead of, you broke the rule, now here's the consequence, restorative justice says who is effective and how do we make it right together. Restorative justice is often structured in about 3 tiers. Tier 1 is prevention. This is where schools build emotional safety before things go wrong through sharing circles, classroom agreements, rules, and community building activities. Students and teachers co-create rules rooted in mutual respect and accountability. This is about creating a culture where kids feel safe to be vulnerable and honest. Tier 2 is intervention. Because when harm does happen, like an argument, a fight, or disrespect, restorative justice uses mediation rather than detention. Students are asked non-judgmental questions to begin, like what happened, who is affected, and how can we make this right? Which this isn't just about conflict resolution. It teaches students reflection, empathy, and communication skills that they'll carry long beyond the classroom and maybe even into college. Tier 3 is reintegration. For students returning from a suspension, expulsion, or incarceration, restorative justice offers a welcoming process that acknowledges the harm, but also emphasizes the student's value in the school community. It prevents extra shame and reduces reoffending, and keeps students connected to their education. And restorative justice doesn't just look good in theory, it's backed by results. For example, in Oakland, California, a pilot school that implemented restorative justice saw an 87% drop in suspensions in just 3 years. Violence decreased, engagement rose. And the reason why is because students weren't just being punished, they were being heard, held accountable, but also brought back into the fold. And something that needs to be clearly said is that restorative justice also emerged from efforts to address racial inequality in school discipline. Black students, especially Black boys, have historically faced disproportionate punishment, often for behaviors rooted in unmet needs or disproportional punishment. Restorative justice reframes those moments not as grounds for removal, but as opportunities for connection. It honors the roots of restorative justice practices and centers community healing, not exclusion. As the study puts it, there is no restorative justice without racial justice. That means educators must also examine the systems and biases that shape how they respond to behavior. I also want to zone in on this connection to EMR, as this sounds familiar from the last slide. Because the restore phase in EMR and the tier 2 mediation in restorative justice are kind of speaking the same language, because both say that relationships matter most when something breaks, because you need to repair it. When a student disconnects, bring them back in, and when we listen deeply and restore trust, we give students not just discipline, but dignity. This isn't just a discipline strategy, it's a philosophy of education that's rooted in care. And finally, for some last words. Because across every source we've explored, from academic studies to real classroom stories, one truth keeps on repeating itself, which is that teacher-student relationships aren't just optional, but they should be essential in academic settings. Whether it's Jalen's sneakers, or a student navigating trauma at home, or a child struggling with anxiety, or poverty, or neurodivergence, we've seen that the classroom is never just about academics, but it's also about survival, self-worth, and feeling safe, especially for a growing student. And when students face non-normative home lives, mental health challenges, or limited resources, it's often the teacher who becomes that one steady, supportive adult who can shift a student's entire trajectory. Especially when some studies show that The students might even see their homeroom teacher even more than they see their own parents. However, the thing is that that kind of relationship building doesn't just happen. It's not a personality for most. It's not that some have it and others don't, but it is a skill and it's a practice and it requires training. From EMR to social emotional learning to restorative justice, the evidence is in your face. When teachers are given real tools, not just content strategies, but relationship strategies, they're better equipped to understand students and meet them where they are and walk them towards social, emotional, and academic growth. Because in the end, teachers don't just teach content, they teach growing human beings. And every relationship build is a chance to tell a student, you matter, you belong, and I believe in you. And that's how teachers can build schools. And that's how administrators can build schools that heal instead of harm. Thank you.